His articles and essays have appeared in the Hartford Courant, the New Haven Register, and the Connecticut Explorer magazine. And if you all haven't found that magazine, it's exceptional, and you should find it and look for any. They have all sorts of great ideas about what to do in the state, and our state is chock full of wonderful things. The Connecticut Trust for Historical Preservation was established in 1975 to protect and promote buildings, sites, structures, and landscapes that contribute to the heritage and vitality of Connecticut communities. Chris wrote a book, and he'll be telling us all about his book, and we welcome him here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So, Connecticut architecture. It's interesting, we don't talk a lot about architecture in our day-to-day lives. Schools seem to devote even less effort to teaching architecture than to other arts, and that leaves us with magazines and HGTV, which rarely go beyond open concept or what's the most fashionable current material for kitchen counters. That's difficult for my colleagues and me because we spend a lot of time talking about architecture and trying to convince people that it's important to them. We define architecture very broadly as making places, shaping the world around us to create places in which to live, to work, to play, to eat, to worship, to learn, to study. Not just buildings, but sometimes groups of buildings, communities, streetscapes, neighborhoods, campuses, landscapes that we design. Those are places. Engineering structures like bridges or dams, and sometimes interior designs which are created independently of the buildings in which they're located. Next. So why is it important? A couple of things. First of all, human beings have bodies. Those bodies occupy space, and what that space is like can make a difference to us. It can be comfortable or uncomfortable. It can make it possible to do what we want to do, or it can hamper us. It can ennoble us or debase us by the quality of its design. Here are a couple of examples. Connecticut Hospice in Branford. This is actually the current building that they're in. It's the second building they've occupied. The first Connecticut Hospice building was the first hospice building in the United States. It was designed over a long process of study and thought about what exactly was needed for the really very difficult mission of the organization. What would help best care for the people who are patients at the hospice, what kind of spaces would be comfortable and comforting for their families and friends, or for the staff who sometimes work under a good deal of stress and emotional challenge. So that those lessons then were also used in remodeling the second building that the organization acquired. Similarly, urban renewal in the middle of the 20th century was based on the idea that architecture could help solve social ills. Rebuilding our cities could make them better places. As we know, that was tragically overstated to the ongoing distress of our cities. But even that failure demonstrates how important the shape of our places in which we live can be to our lives. That's Hartford, with those dotted lines showing where Interstate 84 was just cut right through the middle of the city. Next slide, please. A second reason architecture is important is that I think human beings have an innate urge to create, to make things. Our reaction to place is not passive. We want to remold it to make it more comfortable, to make it more conducive to the things we want to do in it, to express something about what we believe life should be like, or to reflect what life actually is like. Not just in terms of ornament, but sometimes just the very organization of things. To my mind, creating is not just a matter of painting and sculpture. It can be creating a library catalog or doing carpentry. Those are all ways in which we reshape our world. And we all do it. starting with the toddler who smears food on the wall and says, "Look, Mom, you see that done?" So making places can help us to understand something of the way that people lived when a place was created, what they hoped they would be able to live in it, what they wanted, values they wanted to express in their buildings. We'll see some of that in a bit. Next. So to help the people of Connecticut look at architecture, I've written this book, telling stories about 100 places around the state that people have shaped. Buildings, landscapes, towns and neighborhoods, engineering structures, interiors. Each one of them is basically reduced to a single story. Most of them could have lots of stories told about them. Some of them could be an entire book by themselves. But I've tried to sort of keep it to a single point and organized them thematically rather than just chronologically. Stories that group together about different subjects. The first goal for that was just to show people how much variety there is in architecture in Connecticut. It's much more than colonial houses. And the second goal is to see all the different ways you can look at architecture and think about architecture, the stories you can tell about it. Again, it's much more than what style is it. And frankly, another goal was to further the mission of the Connecticut Trust, of helping people to appreciate and want to care for important architecture in the state. So what I'm going to do is run quickly through the chapters that are in the book, describing some of the different approaches I take to architecture. And then I'll read a few of the places, individual places to you, to give you a more in-depth view. So next. It all starts with the landscape. Its topography and the materials it produces begin to determine what and where and how we build. But we, in turn, shape the land as well. The most obvious way this happens is landscaping, often garden designs. On your upper right there is the Harkness Mansion, Eolia, in Waterford, just west of New London. A big summer mansion and estate built by a very wealthy couple. Big house where they would spend their summers, lovely gardens all around it, and beyond that, farmland. They raised cattle, they grew fruits and vegetables, not only to eat when they were there in the summertime, but to ship back to New York in the spring and fall and winter to use for themselves as well. We shaped the landscape in much bigger ways. The Barkhamsted Reservoir there, an entire valley flooded to provide water to Hartford and towns around it. Several miles long, there are a couple of villages under that water, and this big earthen dam that holds the water back down at one end of it, which is designed with a road on it, lined with stone walls and trees that frame the view up the valley. In recent years, we've begun to pay closer attention to the effects of our building activities on the land, and to construct buildings to be sustainable, that is, more sparing in their use of materials and energies, careful not to pollute, careful not to use up resources. So there's Croon Hall on the left at Yale University, part of the forestry school, designed to reduce energy consumption by such things as thick walls that hold heat in, renewable materials like wood for the roof framing, even ground up blue the walls, and then technological things that turn off lights when nobody's in the room, and windows that open so you can have natural ventilation instead of running electricity. So, next. Materials are another thing to look at, and technologies, what we use to build with, and how we put it together. Early buildings used materials that came more or less directly from the earth, like wood. That's the New London courthouse on the left, with those big slabs of wood over the windows designed to look like blocks of stone. Actual stone, there's the Portland Brownstone Quarry, which shipped brownstone not only for use in Connecticut, but far beyond. So much of it was used in New York that nowadays the term brownstone means any row house, no matter what it's built out of. And you can find Connecticut brownstone as far away as San Francisco. In the 19th century, we developed newer materials, such as cast iron. That's the Lover's Leap Bridge in New Milford, made by the Berlin Iron Bridge Company. And new techniques, such as prefabrication. The little house on the left is in New London, built in the 1930s, when architects were experimenting with the idea of mass production and assembly line production to make houses that were more affordable. The same way Henry Ford had used assembly line production to make automobiles more affordable. So that the components of this house were fabricated in a factory, and sometimes even panels that formed the walls. And it was shipped to New London and assembled, and now belongs to Connecticut College. Next. Agriculture has played important roles in Connecticut's economy and life and contributed to the built environment. There have been general purpose farms, such as that of Cyrus Wilson in Harwinton on the, whoops, we're ahead one. Can you back up? No? No, I'm ahead one. Where we live, places to live. Yeah, sorry about that. Places to live are among the most widespread works of architecture. And not just the province of the rich. We have very modest houses from the 18th century. This little house is in Guilford. A footprint of 600 square feet, which was actually typical, average house size for the 18th century. But the houses that have survived from that time tend to be the bigger, better built ones. The Perfect Sixes of Hartford. Again, a very distinctive housing type, like a typical New England triple-decker, but two of them mashed together to make a 6-unit house that's, as I say, distinctive for Hartford, and was built by the hundreds in the late 19th and early 20th century for middle and working class inhabitants. New government regulations in the 1960s made possible condominium ownership, which led to condominium developments all over the state. That's a Heritage Village in Southbury, which also introduced another new idea in living and planning for living, the age-restricted development. Hadn't existed before. And all along, technology is contributing new mechanical systems to make life more comfortable in houses. This plan is from a house in Wethersfield, built in the 1890s, and it's hard to read, but it shows the heating apparatus, the lines that bring water in and sewage out, plumbing for gas. I don't think there's electricity in that house, but and new materials like concrete and iron, all of which had to be integrated into the structure of the house in ways that took a while to learn how to do. Now we get to agriculture. Lower right is the Cyrus Wilson farm in Harwinton, modest house and barn, and a windmill that was added later to help pump water when they got into dairy farming. Rich gentleman farmers helped spread the word of new developments in agriculture and commissioned monumental farm buildings. That's the Hilltop Dairy Barn in Suffield, built by the guy who owned the Indian Motorcycle Company in Springfield, and a veritable cathedral for cattle. Tobacco growing, again a specialty of the Connecticut Valley, contributed not only these tobacco sheds, but an entire landscape. Because the tobacco grown was used for cigar wrappers, it actually needed a shaded environment in which to grow, and a very humid one. So tents would be erected over the fields to protect the plants and hold the humidity in. So that you get an entire landscape that is constantly changing throughout the growing season. Plants are set out, the tents are set up, the tents are pulled back to harvest the leaves are put into the sheds, and the sheds open and shut to get the right ventilation to cure the leaves. So as I say, it's constantly changing, like a living thing almost. Agricultural specialists at the University of Connecticut helped produce new and better farm buildings. This poultry house in Lebanon was designed by a UConn professor taking advantage of the latest research in the 1950s on the best environment in which to raise chickens. It's almost identical to a plan that was published in a book by the United States Department of Agriculture to send out to educate farmers. Next. Connecticut was a leader in the American Industrial Revolution and a manufacturing powerhouse. Many factories were multi-purpose loft buildings, multi-story buildings, usually long and narrow with lots of windows for light and ventilation. That's the Hockenham Mill in Rockville, a textile mill, but that basic layout could accommodate a wide variety of types of machinery and manufacturing processes. There also were more specialized structures, such as the iron furnaces in Litchfield County, which produced high-quality iron in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And industry spurred not only the development of individual factory buildings, but also entire communities, such as Collinsville, where the Collins Axe Company had its factories, but also built housing, schools, churches, stores, a hotel. The employees of the company would spend nearly every minute of their lives in an environment that was planned, created, and controlled by the company, shaping the way they lived in it. Next. As Collinsville shows, architecture can be more than individual structures, but larger constructions, often in which the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. New Haven's Green was an ambitious example of 17th century town planning, and then again in the early 19th century of town improvement, as the three congregations built new churches all at once. The city planted trees in the green, fenced it in to keep roaming animals out, grass, paths, creating a landscape that has survived basically unchanged in its essential nature for 200 years now. During World War I, the builders of Seaside Village in Bridgeport, on the upper right there, this was emergency housing for munitions workers at a time when arm-producing companies were growing at a very rapid rate to supply all the people who were fighting wars against each other. And there was a huge shortage of housing. So the federal government established an agency to build housing in areas where it was needed for key war industries. The agency, the United States Housing Corporation, was staffed by architects and planners who contributed their time as their part of the war effort, but they had an ulterior motive. They wanted to create examples of what they thought were good urban or suburban housing that they hoped private builders would emulate after the war was over. After the war was over, Congress also had hearings to review the progress of the U.S. Housing Corporation, which featured one congressman angrily accusing the agency of unnecessary excellence. We've heard about urban renewal, which drastically remade cities, creating complexes like Constitution Plaza, enclosed and cut off from the city that surround them. That in turn sparked a reaction that encouraged the growth of the preservation movement, and also a more traditional type of planning school known as New Urbanism, which produced, among other things, Blueback Square in West Hartford, which essentially is a shopping mall, built all at once, controlled by a single owner, but it's designed to look like a traditional town, traditional city, I guess, with streets and outdoor streets and parking along the streets and sidewalks and buildings that at least have varied facades, even if they're all probably the same once you get inside. So it's sort of a hybrid between an actual town and a shopping mall. Next. Transportation needs have given rise to specialized building types, such as lighthouses and railroad stations. The examples on the left are both in New London. And transportation-related development for travels, including the Grantmore Motel on the Berlin Turnpike in Newington. It's a zigzag roof designed to catch the eye of the travelers whizzing by at 50 miles an hour. They're moving fast, so you need something that will really reach out and grab them. The transportation contributed to architecture in more subtle ways as well. The house on the lower right is in Thompson Hill, far northeast corner of Connecticut. Small town, but it just happened to be located on the main turnpike that led from Providence to Hartford, Route 44, which goes all the way across the state. And that house looks very much like the work of one particular architect who was working in Providence in the 1820s. So I haven't been able to find out if he actually designed this house in Thompson, or somebody went to Thompson and saw somebody from Thompson went to Providence and saw the architect's work and sort of brought the idea back. But clearly the connection was made along that roadway and resulted in this house. Next. Architecture can serve mental, emotional, and spiritual needs. Congregational meeting houses reflect the theological basis of 18th century Connecticut society. That's Weathersfield on the left. Buildings such as the Middletown Alms House, a poorhouse for the city of Middletown in the center, were part of the way that society took care of those in need. And the Institute of Living created the landscape on the right there. Connecticut's first mental hospital, established in the 1820s. Right around 1860, they turned to Frederick Law Olmsted to design their grounds. Part of Olmsted's work was based on the idea that nature could be a healing, soothing force in people's lives and would actually help the treatment of the people in the mental hospital. But the superintendent also said that having this beautiful setting could help people understand that a mental hospital did not have to be a grim, frightening, bedlam kind of place. And so he opened the landscape, the grounds up to the general public. And they still are open to the public. There's a few more parking lots than Olmsted's drawing shows, but a lot of, in essence, it's still the same. I should say that Olmsted did the original plan. The drawing is by Frederick Weidenman, another Hartford landscape architect who took over the design and execution of the project when Olmsted took on a job with the U.S. Sanitary Commission during the Civil War. Connecticut's long been known for its educational institutions, including local schools, internationally known universities. The Laurel Street School in the bottom center is in Danbury, designed by a Bridgeport architect named Warren Briggs, who around the turn of the 20th century was trying to build a practice with a specialty in school design. Published a book about designing schools, which is where the drawing comes from. Next. Which leads to the stories you can tell about who builds and who is built for and how they interact. Early buildings tend to be created by master builders. They didn't have architects in the way that we think of them, but the people who actually did the building would determine a lot of the design as well. You would just go to your builder and say, I need a house with 3 rooms, and the builder would come up with something. William Spratz, who designed the house in East Haddam on the upper left, came to Connecticut as a soldier, a British soldier during the Revolution, and stayed behind as a builder, and was part of this change in architecture, integrating formal classical elements into buildings more rigorously than had been done before. So you see, columns on the porch, and coins to look like stone blocks in the corners, and cornices and moldings all outlining the house. We have professional architects. We saw Warren Briggs with the school design, Theodate Pope, who designed Avon Old Farm School, one of the first women to practice architecture professionally. But what is built is often determined less by builders than by developers. Suburban developers, in particular after World War II, unrolled housing subdivisions across the countryside. The picture on the lower right is from a development called Broadview Lane in East Windsor. It's taken from a magazine article in a magazine addressed to the building industry. And the article describes how the design of the houses was the result of ongoing circular discussions among the developer, the architect, and the marketing guy. All of them contributing to it to come up with designs that would be economical and easy to build, that would be comfortable and sturdy to live in, and it would have just the right features to attract buyers. And the success is seen in the headline: 53 houses sold out in 30 hours. Architects and builders have to have clients. In Litchfield, Rufus Stillman and his wife arrived in the late 1940s and decided to build a house suitable to the modern age in which they live, appropriate for our time, they said. They brought in Marcel Breuer, an architect trained at the Bauhaus, who ended up living in New Canaan, and actually built 3 houses designed by Breuer. They moved from one to the second to the third and then back to the first. But at the same time, the company for which Rufus Stillman worked, the Torin Manufacturing Company, commissioned factory buildings and office buildings from Breuer. So this is the office building, not just in Torrington and Litchfield, but all around the world. And then the Stillmans sold some land to their neighbors and said, but you have to build a modern house. Well, we've got enough Breuer already. Hire somebody else. So they hired John Johansson, another New Canaan modernist. And one of the neighbors was on the school board, so they hired Johansson to design a school in town. Somebody else was on the library board, so they brought in Elliot Noyce, yet another modernist architect from New Canaan, to design the library. And then people would introduce their neighbors to architects, and they would commission jobs, and you can draw this whole intertwined network of who introduced whom to who and how they influenced the building of this whole collection of significant modernist architecture in Litchfield, the colonial capital of Connecticut, the capital of colonialism in Connecticut. Next. That said, Connecticut's identity still is very much tied up with its colonial past. We're still gathering new information and learning new things about colonial buildings and the society of which they were a part. On the left there is the Batolph Williams House in Wethersfield. When I moved to Connecticut 30 years ago, I was told that house was built in 1670. Well, a few years later, a student really dug into the records and analyzing things very closely realized that it was actually built around 1715. The difference is that it looks like houses that were being built in the Boston area around 1670. And what it's taken a while to find out is that Connecticut was stylistically conservative and kept building 1670 style houses up until about 1725 or so. So a lot of things that were dated by visual comparison have had to be re-examined. The Stanley Whitman House just down the road in Farmington is another one with the same kind of story. In the early 20th century, restoring colonial buildings became a major activity. On the upper right there is the Highland House in Guilford, which was restored as a museum around 1916. It's one of the first house museums that was created not because important person lived there or George Washington slept there, but because of its architecture. And again, it's another one of those whose date has been revised from 1660 to 1713. At the same time that was being built, a new fashion for building buildings that had colonial stylistic inspirations was taking hold in a strong way. So there's Waterbury City Hall, built in 1916 also, designed by Cass Gilbert, best known for the US Supreme Court building, but with a lot of colonial motifs, partly as a celebration of Waterbury's colonial history.
What's his name?
Cass Gilbert. Okay, and of course the building we're in is another example of that. This is 1890 something, isn't it?
1890.
1890, yeah. So an early example of colonial style building, but distinguishable as a product of its time as well. It's got just a level of ornament and detail that probably, and just size, that probably you wouldn't have seen in the 18th century. Next. So as any art, architecture is expressive. It says things about itself, about its owners and builders, about the society in which it's situated. It can proclaim wealth and membership in a social group, like the door of the Ebenezer Grant House in South Windsor, part of the interrelated group of families who ran pretty much everything in the Connecticut Valley in the 18th and early 19th centuries, known as the River Gods. And they had these big, elaborate doorways as kind of their architectural logo. To a builder from Boston, it would appear really provincial and kind of badly done with all the piled up moldings. If 1 is good, 2 is better, and 12 is even better. But it certainly is, again, eye-catching and a clear statement of power and influence. That can happen in the present day as well. The Mashantucket Pequot Museum on the upper right, again, is a proclamation of the Mashantucket Pequots are retaking their place in Connecticut society. It's a sign of the wealth that has been produced by their casinos, and a celebration also of their long history and culture. Not only because it's a museum and it contains artifacts of that history and culture, but even the design of the building, that sort of grid facade with the rectangular things lined up across it, according to the architect, was inspired by wampum. So he says, sometimes architects design something they like and then sort of back their way into an explanation for it. Style can be a language to convey different messages. The 2 Second Empire houses in Plainfield, different size, different scale, different personalities really. The one on the left, good deal smaller. It should be smaller in relation to the one on the right. Then I've got the pictures here. I need to readjust the slide. But it's got lots of frilly brackets and things on it. When it was built, it was described as a tasty little house. And the one on the right, bigger, broader, more sort of buttoned down and monumental and restrained looking. So a different personality expressed in a single style. Next, please. Last, some of the things that I find most fascinating are ways in which architecture grows and changes over time, adapting to new tastes and needs. On the left, the Tainter House in Hampton traces the changing tastes and fortunes of one family over more than 150 years. They lived in it from about 1800 until the 1960s, leaving a building that's more or less 1800 looking on the upper floor, small windows, small panes, big roof with 2 chimneys, so you know there's a center hall. But the lower floor was remodeled around 1860 with its bigger windows, with more elaborate surrounds, and that porch that wraps around it. So it's a little bit schizophrenic, 1800 upstairs, 1860 downstairs, but it gives you an insight into the changing tastes of this one family. On a much bigger scale, the similar thing happened in Naugatuck, where a factory owner brought in McKim, Mead & White, the leading architecture firm in the country around 1900, to design, it's either 2 or 3 schools, I think it's 2, a new church, a new library, a new town hall. They re-landscaped the town green, all really remaking the downtown area in Naugatuck, what had been a slightly gritty, small industrial city, into something that embodied the new classicism and formality that was coming into fashion. And the preservation movement has prompted transformations as well. The factory building there is part of the Cheney Brothers Silk Mills in Manchester, which over the last 40 years has gradually been converted to other uses since the silk mills closed down. So it's been historic designation and incentive programs like tax credits that have made it possible to reuse buildings. This one's been turned into apartments. So those are, that's a quick gallop essentially through the table of contents for the book. And now we'll give you a few of the actual entries to give you a more in-depth flavor. And we start in South Windsor on Main Street. Blessed with some of the most fertile soil in New England, the Connecticut Valley developed into a flourishing agricultural region by the 18th century, with prosperous towns lining the river from Connecticut through Massachusetts and into Vermont and New Hampshire. One piece of this world still survives in South Windsor on the east side of the river. Here, Main Street, the old Riverside Road, has been bypassed by the modern Route 5, leaving an historic landscape that extends nearly 5 miles in length. South Windsor was settled by inhabitants from Windsor on the west bank of the river in the late 17th century. The southern part of the corridor eventually became a community called Windsor Farms, and to the north, a separate community known as East Windsor Hill, built around a ferry landing where merchants shipped agricultural products to New York and the West Indies and brought in goods to sell to local population. Some of these businessmen made fortunes and built splendid mansions. Ebenezer Grant's door, the one we saw from the River Gods, is in this community. Windsor Farms didn't get this kind of wealth until well into the 19th century, when tobacco became the Connecticut Valley's most important agricultural product. And that sparked a boom that continued well into the 20th century. Impressive as they are, the houses are only part of the bigger picture. Also of note are rows of trees that line the street, barns and sheds and other outbuildings, warehouses and stores, and workers' homes and boarding houses. Suburban infill is on the increase, but for the moment remains largely unobtrusive. Next, please. Most important is the shape of the land itself. It steps up and back from the river in a series of terraces. The first level is alluvial plain, with fertile sediment and devoted almost entirely to cropland, now as it was 300 years ago. A steep bank leads up to the second tier, where the street runs, safe from flooding, and where most of the buildings are concentrated. Beyond that are more fields, and then another rise up to where Route 5 is now. This topography determined the shape of the settlement. The inhabitants divided the land into narrow strips running east from the river, which gave each property owner a bit of each type of land: fields for crops, a home lot on the street, and pasture and woodland farther in. You can still see this pattern in the parallel field divisions and roads running back from the river. Older than any of the surviving buildings, this landscape still provides the framework for South Windsor's present-day life and development, a living inheritance from colonial days. Next, yeah. Schools for all. From its founding, Connecticut has valued public education. The Puritans believed that all believers should be able to read the Bible, and so made ecclesiastical societies responsible for running schools. Later, towns formed school districts to raise money for buildings and teacher salaries through taxes and fees. In 1795, Connecticut set aside the proceeds from the sale of its Western Reserve lands in Ohio as a school fund to supplement local monies. In practice, however, support for schools was uneven. When Winchester's 8th District School burned in the 1790s, A replacement wasn't built until sometime after 1812. In the meantime, students met wherever they could, sometimes in homes, occasionally in a barn. Like most rural schools, the new building when it was built was utilitarian, with a post and beam frame, uneven clapboards, and an unadorned door and window openings, as you see. Given the school's nickname, Little Red School, it must have been painted red at some point, but very possibly not at first. Apart from a narrow vestibule, it contains a single classroom, lit by windows on 3 sides, heated by a stove, and lined with plain wainscoting and plaster. Next, the school does have one touch of architectural distinction, a barrel-vaulted plaster ceiling. In fact, a surprising number of country schools from the federal era have or had ceilings like this, including 2 others in the town of Winchester. The reason for them is not clear. Perhaps the vaults were thought to improve acoustics. Perhaps the additional height made packed classrooms seem a bit less crowded. Or perhaps the arched shape, which was more difficult to build, was a reminder that in spite of its Spartan appearance, this building fulfilled an important civic function and was worthy of respect. What was it like to attend the Little Red School? One clue is in a writing shelf that runs partway around the room. Unfortunately, you don't see it in this picture, but it's just like a counter that's on the outside walls. Such shelves were typical of 19th century schools, but few survive. Having students sit with their back to the teacher may seem inconvenient, but the children attending such schools varied widely in age and level of learning. Teachers would assign quiet work to some, while they gave lessons to or heard recitations from others. Facing the wall might have helped those who were working on their own to concentrate. Although 19th century Connecticut schools had a good reputation, they apparently had many shortcomings as well. A report to the General Assembly in 1837 found that most of the state's rural schools suffered from insufficient funding, low parent interest, poorly qualified teachers, and ill-constructed buildings. Of 103 schools examined, only 31 were considered to be in good repair. Ironically, the school fund was partly to blame for this. Although it was envisioned as a supplement for local funding, many districts took its availability as an excuse to eliminate school taxes, with the result that spending for education actually declined in some communities. The 1837 report sparked a series of efforts to improve and modernize Connecticut schools, a process that eventually led to the closing of the Little Red School in 1908. So neglect and reform both contributed to the preservation of this little school. The district never significantly updated the building, leaving it almost entirely unchanged. And then after it was closed, it was bought by a member of the community whose father had been a member of the school board and a proponent of educational improvement. So it's now operated as a museum by a private association to preserve this little bit of Connecticut's educational history. Next. So, copying is a big issue. Historically, architects often copied from other works, sometimes a detail, sometimes a general outline, sometimes an entire building. Successful structures from the past were seen to offer useful models for later builders. This changed with the advent of modernism, which taught that technological and social changes had severed modern life irrevocably from the past. Every project had to start from scratch with an analysis of the client's needs and then develop a unique solution to fit those specific requirements. Next, please. Embodying the pre-modern idea of architectural copying, The Yale Divinity School was based on Thomas Jefferson's design for the University of Virginia. Jefferson conceived his university as a village. Professors lived and taught in the two-story pavilions facing a lawn and linked by one-story ranges that had student rooms in them. Colonnaded walkways provided sheltered access between the buildings, and at the head of the lawn, a half-size copy of the Pantheon in Rome housed the library. For architects Delano and Aldrich and the Divinity School leadership, Jefferson's plan held great appeal, both as a model for organizing a residential professional school and as a symbol for a community of learning. The architects followed Jefferson's basic scheme quite closely. 2 rows of pavilions and connectors, with colonnaded walkways in between, a dominant principal building at the head of the lawn, even the use of red brick and white trim as in Jefferson's buildings. Next. But the differences are equally important. Stylistically, Delano and Aldrich swapped Jeffersonian Palladianism for New England Federal. The focal building is a chapel rather than a library, and it's modeled on a congregational meeting house, not a Roman temple. Professors' houses were not required, so the pavilions contained only student rooms. Classrooms and common spaces were fit into bigger wings, flanking and behind the chapel. Those rear wings represent the architect's most important modification of their model. Jefferson's composition built up from the foot of the lawn to a climax in the rotunda, but then stopped abruptly, leaving the backside unfinished. The Divinity School similarly builds up to the chapel, but then tapers off again, with rear wings and the more enclosed courtyard between them, giving the composition a more satisfying conclusion. At its completion in 1932, the Divinity School was widely admired as a skillful adaptation of a famous prototype. But in the 1990s, when the school began to plan renovations, modernist disdain for copying intruded on the process. The renovation architect, Robert Clement, opened a presentation of his plans by saying that the Divinity School wasn't very good architecture. It was only a copy. This attitude comes through in some of the design decisions that Clement made. Clearly made to avoid any suggestion of copying, their clunky postmodernist design clashes with the original delicate interiors. Sometimes fitting in is more important than originality. And next, please. Suburbanism and all the different forms it can take. Immigrants to the United States have long followed a pattern of settling first in cities, which offered job opportunities, inexpensive housing, and the chance to congregate with fellow immigrants. Subsequent generations, after establishing themselves economically and socially, might then move to the suburbs. In the last third of the 20th century, that pattern began to break down as more and more employers also left the cities and new immigrants followed them. Since it opened in 1996, the Mohegan Sun Casino, located in the town of Montville, has employed large numbers of immigrants, many of them coming from China. In part, these numbers reflect the casino's many Chinese customers, thanks to cultural traditions that encourage gambling. And in part, they reflect rising levels of immigration from China and the many entry-level jobs that the casino offers. From 2000 to 2010, Montville's Chinese-born population grew from 110 to 949, an increase of 763%, during a period when the town's total population grew by only 5%. The influx of Chinese immigrants is changing the face of Montville. Most visible are the growing numbers of Chinese restaurants, markets, and businesses along area roads. Next. But the influx also affects residential areas. Mostly employed in low-paying positions, the immigrants tend to share houses. Ordinary split levels or raised ranches originally built for American nuclear families. Architect Stephen Fan has documented that the immigrants use and modify these houses to accommodate groups of unrelated persons and to fit Chinese cultural patterns. Within the houses, occupants have their own bedrooms while sharing kitchens, bathrooms, and common spaces. Some spaces intended to be common, such as living rooms, may end up being subdivided to create additional bedrooms. Garages with their doors left open may serve as porches where occupants sit to watch the world and chat with passing neighbors. Changes extend to the landscape as well. Vegetables grow in front yards, spreading out under trees or climbing on homemade trellises built from branches collected in the woods. Laundry and even fish hang out to dry. And since many of the immigrants do not own cars, they walk to work and elsewhere, wearing paths along roads that have no sidewalks, while traffic whizzes by. Many of these choices are economic. Most immigrants cannot afford to live by themselves or buy cars, and growing their own food also saves money. But according to Fan, there are other factors as well. Shared housing provides companionship and assistance. Walking rather than driving provides healthful exercise and fresh air for workers in the windowless casino. And vegetable gardens can supply foods that are not available in the local stores, while giving the gardeners, again, some exercise and perhaps a sense of fulfillment. Next. Sometimes these different ways of living create friction with earlier residents. Legally, the immigrants may run up against building and zoning codes, which limit the number of unrelated people who may share a single-family house, or regulate how spaces are divided. Socially, they run up against suburban customs, such as those which relegate socializing and functional activities to backyards, leaving front yards for display. These regulations or customs are typically justified as needed to protect public health and safety or property values. However, they too may reflect cultural biases. Why, for instance, would 10 unrelated people necessarily be more crowded or noisy than 10 related people? In a sense, perhaps the most serious violation is the revelation of diversity among Montville's residents. The violation of the long-standing suburban emphasis on conformity. One review of Fan's work says, "For all our ethnic pride and diversity, we Americans tend to hide our differences behind closed doors." It's been argued that a central purpose of suburbia is to obscure difference. But in peeling back some of the architecture's superficial uniformity, Stephen Fan's study of Chinese residents in Montville makes America easier to see. Next. So those are some of the stories that architecture can help us to tell. We can see how the landscape in which we live was shaped and continues to be shaped by decisions made by the very first English settlers. We can see how schools have developed and been used in the role that they played in society. We can talk about copying and the use of models in architecture, and look at the ways in which new immigrants adapt buildings to meet their needs and change the built environment. Next. Places like these, with stories like these, are a living record of the people of Connecticut and the active and varied lives they've pursued. They've tried many ways of making their living. They've absorbed influences from other places and times. They've been intellectually curious and prosperous enough to keep up with and sometimes contribute to changing fashions. They've been technologically innovative, and as the state's population has grown ever more diverse socially and ethnically, they've introduced new lifestyles and tastes and aspirations to shape their environment. This book is a starting point. I hope it will inspire its readers to learn more about Connecticut and its architecture, but more than that, to see and experience it for yourselves. Next. Elizabeth Mills Brown, a historian from Guilford with whom I worked, said, "Architecture is for everyone, and there's enough to go around if we'll only learn to take care of it. We can't write it all down on convenient lists that we carry in our pockets, but it's all around you, wherever you go. So go out, keep your eyes open, enjoy every bit of it, whether it's on somebody's list or not, and above all, guard it." Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? The owner of the Ensign House has just walked in. Came in. We were talking about it earlier and saving architecture,
Yes.
which is
yeah.
very important.
So, yeah,
Trying to get a picture of all of you here somewhere.
thank you. Yes.
Krista, does your group work much with local historical societies, town historical societies across the state?
We do. We have employees that field service people that we call circuit riders who spend almost all their working time meeting with local community groups, historical societies, other kinds of groups, municipal bodies, individual property owners, helping to identify possibilities for historic buildings, to explain designation and bureaucracies, to identify sources of funding, to think about different ways of using them. So, yeah. Yes?
Do you have a favorite something that you discovered while you were researching?
Oh gosh, no, it's whatever was the last one I was looking at.
Okay,
So, yeah. I mean, I gave some hints. Anyway, I'm interested particularly in the way that places get changed over time. They have layers of different meanings. So, yeah. Yes?
I'm always a big fan of obviously any walkable city or downtown,
Mhm.
say for example like New Haven or West Hartford Center. Are there some out there that aren't really kind of well known as being a good walkable area that you've come across?
New London has Bank Street and State Streets, a nice compact walkable area. Norwich is a fascinating city. It's got a downtown that's kind of like Boston, laid out by drunken cattle or something on a steep hillside, and then sort of neighborhoods that stretch out from that are really interesting places to walk in. Nice park, yeah. Mhm. So, yeah. So I do have some books, if anyone would like to buy one. I'm afraid I'm not equipped for credit cards, but cash or checks, they cost $40. I've also brought copies of the Connecticut Trust newsletter and brochure if you're interested in hearing more about what the Connecticut Trust does. Yeah.
The Little Red Schoolhouse or Little Red School
Yeah.
in Winchester, have you been there?
I have, yes. Yeah, it's open like, 3 weekends a year or something, but
And it's, you drive by and almost miss it, right?
yeah, it's not at the green or anything. It's
Yeah.
just sort of on the road in the woods. Yeah.
Because I know where it is. And
Mhm.
my husband went by at one time when, I guess, the Historical Society for it, or the association you were talking about.
Yeah, I think it's a separate association. Yeah.
Yeah, they were there like painting it and
Mhm.
cleaning it up, and he was chit-chatting with them.
Yeah.
So, I was just wondering if that was the same one, and it is. So
Mhm.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
I love those.
Yeah.
Colebrook opens theirs to the kids within the school,
Mhm.
and that's my class, they have to go there. And they left the outdoor outhouse, so the kids had to use that, which
Mhm.
I thought was kind of a good idea. People know what it was like.
Yeah.
Another thing about schoolhouses, do you know, are you familiar with,
Mhm.
if there was an old schoolhouse,
Mhm.
why it would be torn down or try to be saved, guarded, that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing? Do you have any idea of what requires it to be
It's,
stored and everything?
yeah, I mean, it's usually sort of somebody in the neighborhood and somebody in the community thinks it's important. A number of them have been converted into houses or something, and some of them got neglected once they were no longer used as schools and just allowed to fall down. Some of them were allowed to basically fall down while they were still being used as schools, as we heard. But, it's very often somebody decides this is important to me and gets going the same way that a lot of these house museums,
The reason why I mention it, my father-in-law was from Simsbury, and he went to Little Red Schoolhouse years ago when 10 was a dirt road.
Mhm.
And the Historical Society in Simsbury went to a discussion of the Phelps House, something talking about schoolhouses, and they had pictures, and they were going around trying to restore them and like put plaques on them.
Mhm.
And my husband said, oh, there was a schoolhouse my dad went to, and they had no idea, and he brought the picture of his dad in front of the schoolhouse. And it was here on Route 10, and now it's torn down, and I know it was converted into a house, but we're trying to figure out why it got torn down, or maybe it burned down, I have no idea. I was just curious, so it's one of those things that, especially my husband's family, that are really into historical value of things, especially in Simsbury Graham. It's very interesting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
We have refreshments.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.